Okay, good evening, good afternoon, sorry, everybody. So I was tasked with giving a presentation, cutting-edge cave diving. So I thought to myself, well, what is cutting-edge cave diving? What does it actually mean? Could it be defined by distance, penetration distance or depth? Well, that's sort of relative to time. For example, in the 70s, Mike Woodin made a 1,000-foot, 300-meter cave dive. It was the first time anyone had broken the psychological barrier and gone that distance. Yet, it might sound strange. Nowadays, a person who's never been in the cave before, but who is an accomplished diver, could go greater distances there in the course of his fast-track cave diving course. So things are relative. But I sort of come to the conclusion that really cutting-edge divers, you've got to be pioneering. And I don't just mean finding new passage, but you've got to be breaking psychological barriers, developing your own equipment, and things like that to develop yourselves. So this is a story of mainly the people that Martin's just covered, myself, Jason and John, of our development and some of the stuff we have done. This is not cutting-edge cave diving, but this is myself on the right there in 1982. It was an exploratory dive, but this really sums up sort of British cave diving. British cave diving, you come from a caving background. You, in the 60s, 70s, 80s, wetsuit wellies, small cylinders covered in mud. That's about sums it up. But whilst that's what we were doing over here, on the right there, that was the same year, early 1982, on the right there, Jochen Hasselmeier. He was a cutting-edge cave diver. He developed his own rebreathers that Martin had been talking about. He was using them to explore caves. He was pushing the barriers. And down there on the left, Olivier Isler, again, using rebreathers that he had developed himself. You could not buy a rebreather. The military used them, but they were not commercially available. What might really strike you about these two people is they weren't cavers. They were divers that dived in caves. And one of the sites they turned to was the Vassell. This is a cross-section from one of Martin's earlier books. And this was sort of seen at the time. Olivier Isler dived there in early 90s. This was seen the pinnacle of cave diving. And when Olivier Isler dived here, he was breaking barriers. It's approximately 2 kilometers long, 80 meters deep, relatively deep. You have to have helium mixtures. He had a triply redundant rebreather, and he basically was penetrating in, and the cave was going shallower, and then to get shallower, you have to decompress. So he was the first person to actually decompress whilst going into a cave. So that was a psychological barrier broken. But he was following on the footsteps of Jochen Hasselmeier. And this whole tale of our exploits it's not going to exotic places, finding vast systems. It's really incremental steps, keeping pace with advances in technology to break new ground in well-known caves in sort of popular areas of Europe. So Olivier Isler had passed this siphon. It was an incredible dive. He decompressed inwards. And as he was floating on the surface of the water, looking at the dry passage continuing on, he couldn't get out his gear. He couldn't walk along it, which to us seemed utterly incredible. As cavers, from a caving background, what you want to do is go to a place like this and start caving. The diving is just a means to get there. So we were thinking about the concept of these. Our caving was good. We needed to up our diving to be able to do these sort of dives. So I'm going to introduce this is back in 98. That's the young Jason, young myself. There was nothing particularly technical about our equipment. We didn't have rebreathers. We had open circuit cylinders. And we calculated that to get past where Olivier had, we would require 13 cylinders. So we were developing techniques of wearing lots of cylinders, staging them into the cave, coming out, staging more, using them to stage more, until we had a whole string of cylinders, which we would then dive from, swapping 4 out at a time to get to the end, and have enough not only to decompress to the surface, but to be able to get back safely and to go on further beyond to to whatever we may find. So I developed, as I said, most of the people, Olivier and I joined a German expedition a few years prior to this. Their equipment, they had to be helped into it. It was not modular. They were not able to support themselves. They were not able to dress themselves. So we had a system where we could get out the water, de-kit and kit up ourselves and be totally autonomous and independent. We were actually, cave diving is a competitive sport. Well, we were there and there was someone competing against us, a German guy who had rebreathers, he was a millionaire, he had lots of helpers and stuff, but he was not a caver, and this is a theme that I'm going to keep referring to. He actually passed this section of underwater cave a few days before us, but there was bad CO2, which he didn't like. Then he came to a boulder choke. He'd never met a boulder choke before. So he looked at it and saw all the boulders and assumed there was no way through. So when we got there a few days later, we just walked through the boulder choke, and that was the start of a multi-year project, which I'll come back to in a sec. This is another project I did with Jason. We went over to Florida. We'd met up with the visionary sort of cave diving expeditionary leader and diver, Dr. Bill Stone, and he invited us to a project in Florida that he was running, which was using rebreathers. Here they are stacked up on the course that we were doing. And we were given instruction on this, and we went out on a 3-month project, which was sort of based on commercial diving techniques. So that's Jason and myself rigging up a diving bell. There's the big bell thing can be lowered into the water, hoiked up onto this big gantry, swung across to this chamber here, which is a decompression chamber. So it's very much on commercial diving lines. That's a picture there. And we would, whilst it was not necessarily much exploration, it was an incredible insight into modern technology and diving, and it held us in great stead for future diving. Another aspect of this project was this device here. Scooter, Martin's shown plenty of pictures of scooters. So to go any length of distance, it's best not to swim. It's best to be towed along for various physiological reasons. But this one not only was a scooter, that array at the front is a 32 sonar array. And that is the pre-runner of the sunfish, which Martin showed earlier. And the next stage for these devices, Bill has NASA contracts to design a thing to go to Europa and explore under the ice cap of Europa. So that's us, that's Jason and myself, and we were given unprecedented access to these rebreathers, and we were tasked with configuring it into a double rebreather, which is worn on my back there. And so this, again, held us in good stead for being able to make and modify our own equipment to our own ends. And one thing we learned, that this wasn't the way to go forward. It's far too bulky. Back to the Vassell, our push-in times around now, 99, 2000, had gone up to 24 hours caving. Well, that's not unusual, but to have to do a deep and technical dive at 5 in the morning when your body's at a low leb, is quite not only dangerous, but also physiologically it could create more problems with decompression. So we started camping in the cave. So this is a picture of Jason with his dry tube. That's a later picture. But these blue tubes hold all our camping gear, sleeping bag, food, stoves, and things like that. So we were the sort of first people to start camping beyond long and technical sumps. And we extended the cave out. Oh, there's Jason camping in there. This is a more modern photo. John on a camp bed, which we took in. We wanted to emulate what happened in Wakula, but all we could stretch to was an upturned wheelie bin, which we stole from the side of the road. And that's Jason and myself sat in this upturned wheelie bin to create a bubble of air, just to create a bit of warmth, and you can eat, and a bit of security for the longer decompression stops. So quick plan view. So Olivier Risler had passed this siphon in 1993, I think it was. We extended the cave to the very end by 2001. And no one really followed up on this for years and years. But now that first siphon that was the pinnacle of cave diving, now that's seen as a classic test piece, much the same way that the north face of the Eiger was seen in its day. So numerous people, that is the pinnacle of their cave diving career, going there and coming back. That's the test of how good they are. Having done this project, when we cast our eyes around, there were numerous other similar projects throughout Europe that were like this. The technical divers hadn't got the caving skills, and the cavers turned divers hadn't got the diving skills. So there was a whole load of caves that really were crying out to be looked at. And this is one, the Col de Vecchi in Italy, 2.5 kilometre long sump, had been dived by Olivia Isler. And here, this was a project with John Valanthan, the other member of the trio, at the same sort of time we were doing Wookey Hole. Some of the equipment. A lot of equipment, as Martin said, real concentration to put it all on. That's a picture of me on the scooter, surrounded by cylinders, dry tubes, rebreathers. And I think it's fair to say that we're not just going on a dive, we're going on a full-on underwater journey here. And we were to be in the cave for days on end. And we found an air chamber where we camped, further kilometres of sump, and then ended in a big waterfall. So that's one style of diving, sort of what our specialist was, what I'm going to call multi-sump long-distance penetration dive. Another cutting-edge form of diving, deep diving. This cave here, Saint-Sever in France, it had an end point at about 100 metres depth. No one could find the way on. When I went to look, I could only describe it as, when I went there was something that looked just like Poetic Justice in County Pot. And I recognised it immediately, and that was the key to finding the way on. People had been diving deep down shafts, but the next sort of stage in development was to do penetrations at quite extreme depths. I'm talking 180 metres, things like that. Again, massive equipment. Additional equipment, if you're going to spend 15 hours in the water, it doesn't matter if it's relatively warm compared to England, you need suit heating, undersuit heating and electronics. Our habitats had gained in technological, we had ropes and we could lower it and raise it in the water column. So it was basically like riding an elevator up through the water column to decompress. And again, it's a safe place of safety. Drink beer if you choose, which isn't advised. But and generally, it's a sort of haven to resolve any problems before. The last incremental steps to the surface are the most dangerous. Meanwhile, whilst we'd been doing this, Jason had been beavering on his own. We had some joint projects like connecting the famous show cave Padarac to its resurgence. But Jason had largely been working on his own in Pothawazol, resulting in his final solo trip in 2007, where he'd penetrated 3.5 kilometres into the final sump. And it was at this point that he decided that he needed to call in extra help, because it was beyond the means of one person to go there and have all the pressure on himself. Martin's discussed this a bit. This is sump 2. That's the sort of array of equipment we would have for such dives. First, we would do successive solo dives, I'm going to call it, where one person would do a dive, relay the information to the next person who would maybe dive the day or 2 days after, and therefore continue like that. All this is about exploration, but there are other ways that our diving has been utilised, and this is, I was hesitant about including this, and that is to help resolve incidents abroad. So I was called by the French authorities saying we've got a diver missing, we haven't got any cave divers capable of going there, we really absolutely need you guys over here. So I said, what about Eric Esteblay? And they hesitated, and they said, well, it is Eric Esteblay. He's been on a dive, and he hasn't come back. So we were whisked over the English Channel in a helicopter. Civil defence jet came to pick us up. That's the only time there was 3 of us on a civil defence jet. We flew to Switzerland to pick up a mate. Equipment was dropped off at a random airfield in the south of France and picked up by the fire service, taken to the cave and helped and dived. I'm rushing through this, but this was a very intensive week-long project which unfortunately didn't have a happy ending, but we were at least able to provide services to give closure to the family in this incident. Back to Pothuel's, which was concurrent with all this. One thing that was missing was the surveys of underwater caves. With all this technology, apart from Bill's mapper, which cost $1 million, people were still counting knots or tags on bits of string. So John, who is an electrical engineer, developed a mapper. There he is in Pothuel's. And we were able to get what we feel is a very accurate map of all the first few siphons, 8 kilometers of diving into where the cave changes character. So we've been able to map that, we feel, quite successfully. And then beyond that, it develops into streamway and multi-sump. So the incredible thing, this is the pinnacle of our cave diving. All that development leading up to these huge dives, camping in the caves with all this equipment. And at the end of this, to continue further, we've reverted back to that first photo, wearing wetsuits, wellies, small cylinders, and being proper cavers underground at the extreme end of this cave. So it's gone completely full circle. And that's just a picture of Jason, John, and myself. And I believe time's going to run out. And so, just one look to the future. We've sort of run out of caves where we're going to go, but this is one cave, the Deux de Colly in the Dordogne region of France. We had permission to go there. The conditions weren't very good. This is one cave where we'd still love to go and use our skills to explore that. The person that had been to the end is a non-caver, and he can't really find the way on, as has been the case in many of these situations I've described. We would love to go there if we got permission to continue. There you go.